Princess Diana ever discuss him?
Yes, very fondly, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
When you look back, was there one particular time when you and Princess Diana just had a ball together?
There are friendships that history records in polished official photographs, two famous people smiling at a charity gala, side by side for the cameras. And then there are friendships that live in something else entirely, in whispered conversations at the back of royal functions, in private phone calls made across the Mediterranean Sea, in the desperate grip of a hand on a shoulder inside a cathedral drowning in grief. The friendship between Sir Elton John and Princess Diana was unapologetically the second kind. For years, the world was given a curated version of who Diana was: the shy, downcast eyes, the careful wave, the dignity of a woman born to save a crown. But Elton John, the man who knew her longer and more honestly than almost anyone outside the palace walls, has a very different story to tell. And the actual truth is far more complicated, far more human, and far more extraordinary than anything the Royal Press Office ever put out. The night everything began. The year was 1981, and Elton John was already a man who had seen enough of the world to be hard to impress. He had sold out arenas on 5 continents. He had performed for heads of state. He had worn costumes so outrageous they had become legendary. And yet, by the time he walked into Windsor Castle for Prince Andrew's 21st birthday party, even he felt the weight of those ancient stone walls. He was there to perform alongside percussionist Ray Cooper. And when he arrived, what he found was not the raucous royal celebration one might expect. It was a quiet disco, the music barely audible above the murmur of conversation among lords, ladies, and members of the most powerful family in Britain. In his 2019 autobiography Me, Elton recalled the surreal experience of dancing with Princess and even Queen Elizabeth II herself, the Queen clutching her handbag as they moved to Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock. He admitted he did his best to maintain a facial expression that suggested this was all perfectly normal. But everything shifted the moment Diana Spencer walked in. She was not yet a princess. The wedding to Prince Charles was still months away. But she carried something in her that stopped the room. According to Elton's own account in Me, she was blessed with an extraordinary social ease, an ability to make people feel completely comfortable from the very first word. Within minutes, the two of them had found each other in the crowd, and within minutes of that, they were doing the Charleston together on the ballroom floor, laughing loudly and making faces at the absurdity of it all while the most serious people in England looked on. It was not the behavior of a future princess anxious to please the palace. It was the behavior of someone who had decided, very quietly, that life was too short for stiff formality. Elton later told author Craig Brown that Diana was a real gossip and incredibly indiscreet, and that she was the best company you could ever hope for at a dinner party. You could ask her anything, he said, and she would tell you. That first night planted the seed of a friendship that would outlast royal titles, public scandals, bitter silences, and finally, death itself. The Diana nobody photographed. What Elton came to understand over the years that followed was that the woman the public adored was only one half of a far more interesting person. The Diana the world saw, composed, charitable, photographed with dying children and landmine victims, was entirely real. But she was also the product of extraordinary discipline, of years spent performing composure under conditions that would have broken most people. Behind closed doors, in the company of someone she truly trusted, Diana was someone else. She was sharp. She was wicked. She was, in Elton's word, fabulous. In Me, Elton described her as the best dinner guest you could ever have, someone who arrived knowing things you never expected a princess to know and left having made you laugh harder than you had in months. She had an eye for the ridiculous, especially when it came to the internal workings of royal life, the stiff protocols, the performative dignity, the thousand small rules that governed every moment of existence inside the institution she had married into. She would talk about all of it with a candor that was almost shocking, given the world she inhabited. She teased Elton about his taste in clothes, his famously enormous spectacles, the sheer theatrical excess of his public persona. And he gave it right back, performing exaggerated versions of his own rock star stories to make her double over with laughter. They were, in the truest sense, two people who understood each other's particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of being watched by the entire world and never being fully seen. Because that was the deeper thing. Both of them, in their very different worlds, were outsiders who had been welcomed into circles where they never quite belonged. Elton was a working-class boy from Pinner, Middlesex. who had become one of the most recognizable humans on Earth, fighting private battles with addiction and identity even as stadiums roared his name. Diana was a girl from a noble family who had been handed the most watched role in Western culture without being truly prepared for its demands, and who found herself increasingly isolated within the institution she had joined. When they sat together, they were not rock star and princess. They were two people who recognized in each other the specific exhaustion of public life and the hunger for something genuine beneath all the performance. The Hollywood incident nobody expected. One evening at Elton's home, the combination of Diana's natural magnetism and the presence of Hollywood's biggest names produced a moment that was both hilarious and, in retrospect, completely inevitable. Elton had gathered a group that included actors Richard Gere and Sylvester Stallone. At the time, Diana was separated from Prince Charles, and Richard Gere had recently ended a relationship of his own. According to Elton's account, retold and confirmed in multiple sources including his autobiography, the two found each other immediately. They settled on the floor near the fireplace and sank into a conversation so consuming that the rest of the room appeared to cease to exist for them. The problem was Sylvester Stallone. He had come that evening with a specific interest in meeting Diana, and what he witnessed happening between her and Gere was not sitting well with him. The tension in the room began to thicken. By the time dinner was announced, Gere and Stallone had both disappeared from the room. Elton's partner went to find them and returned looking alarmed. The two men had squared up to each other in the hallway, on the verge of an actual physical confrontation. Two of Hollywood's most bankable action stars were apparently prepared to trade punches over who would get to spend the evening with the Princess of Wales. They were talked down and steered to the dinner table, but Stallone spent the meal fuming. When dinner was over and Diana returned to her conversation with Gere on the sitting room floor, Stallone made his decision. He left, reportedly announcing on his way out that he would never have come if he had known Prince Charming was going to be there. What struck Elton most was how Diana handled all of it. She appeared not to have noticed. She remained entirely herself, warm, engaged, easy, throughout the whole evening. Elton wrote in me that straight men seemed to completely lose their minds in her presence, as though they were simply bewitched. He observed that she was not performing this effect and did not appear to be using it deliberately. It was simply what she did. She walked into a room and gravity rearranged itself around her, the cause that bound them. If laughter was the first thing that connected Elton John and Princess Diana, their shared rage at injustice was what made the bond truly unbreakable. In the mid-1980s, AIDS was devastating entire communities. The disease was surrounded by a fog of terror and misunderstanding that translated, in practical human terms, into cruelty. People with AIDS were routinely abandoned, by employers, by neighbors, by families, sometimes by the medical institutions meant to care for them. They were treated as though their suffering were contagious, as though proximity to them were a form of danger. Elton was watching friends in the music and fashion worlds die, and watching them die in conditions of isolation that compounded their agony. In April 1987, Diana did something that people who lived through it still describe as one of the most genuinely consequential moments of the decade. She officially opened Britain's first dedicated HIV and AIDS unit at the London Middlesex Hospital. The media had spent the days beforehand speculating about one specific question. Would she wear gloves? The answer, delivered in front of cameras that broadcast the image around the world, was no. She walked up to a patient and took his hand in hers without any protective covering. As Elton said in a 2018 address at a Princess of Wales memorial lecture, one simple handshake, one gesture, showed the world the desperate need for humanity toward people living with AIDS. She knew, he said, that the disease could not be passed through touch. Her gesture meant that nobody should be left behind. She did not distinguish between us and them. That single act had consequences that radiated outward for years. It gave people permission to reconsider their fate. It gave those who were ill the dignity of being treated as human beings worth touching. And it gave Elton, watching from his own corner of the crisis, a partner in something larger than either of them. He went on to establish the Elton John AIDS Foundation, which became the defining charitable work of his life, and Diana's example and encouragement were, by his own account, central to that decision. They shared intelligence, coordinated appearances, and supported each other's events. As Elton later wrote, that famous photograph of her holding a patient's hand at Middlesex Hospital was Diana at her most essential, not necessarily trying to make a political statement, but simply being incapable of treating a suffering person as anything other than worthy of love. The silence that nearly cost everything. By the mid-1990s, the friendship had deepened into something that both of them clearly depended on, which makes what happened next both painful and instructive. The fashion designer Gianni Versace, a close friend of both of them, created a photography coffee table book called Rock and Royalty, with proceeds designated for the Elton John AIDS Foundation. Diana had agreed to write the book's foreword. She had seen the contents, which included photographs of famous men, some of them quite sparsely dressed, styled in Versace. Tickets to the launch fundraising dinner had been sold. By some accounts, over $400,000 worth had already been purchased on the expectation that Diana would pay. Then, with very little notice, she pulled out. In Me, Elton wrote that Diana claimed she had no idea about the book's contents, a version of events he flatly disputed, noting that Versace had shown her everything and she had said she loved it. His interpretation was that Buckingham Palace had seen advance copies and decided that a member of the royal family could not be publicly associated with a book featuring semi-nude images of men. It was, in Elton's view, the palace intervening to protect its image at the direct expense of a charity that was saving lives. He did not take it quietly. He sent Diana a message that told her precisely how he felt, how much money she had cost the AIDS Foundation, and how disappointed he was. The response he received back was not from the Diana he knew. It was formal, short, and cold, the kind of letter a princess sends to close off a relationship rather than the kind a best friend sends when she wants to talk things through. And for months after that, they did not speak at all. The two most famous friends on earth went entirely silent. Elton, who by his own admission was too proud to reach out first, missed her humor and her company every single day. And Diana, surrounded by advisors who had their own opinions about who she should be seen to associate with, did not call. It is worth pausing on this, because it reveals something important about the institutional pressures that shaped Diana's life. She was not a free agent. She was a woman caught between the person she genuinely was and the role she was expected to perform. Even her friendships were subject to review. And while Elton understood this intellectually, he was still hurt. The silence stretched on for months, until something happened that put all of it into perspective. The phone call that repaired everything. On July 15, 1997, Gianni Versace was shot and killed outside his home in Miami. The murder sent shockwaves through the worlds of fashion, music, and celebrity. For Elton, the grief was immediate and overwhelming. He was at his home in Nice when the phone rang, and the voice on the other end was Diana's. She was on a boat in the Mediterranean with Dodi Fade and his family. She asked how Elton was holding up, and whether he had spoken to Versace's sister Donatella. And then, according to Elton's account in Me, she said simply, "I'm so sorry. It was a silly falling out. Let's be friends." Just like that, the months of silence dissolved. The two of them agreed to attend Versace's funeral together in Milan. A week later, on July 22nd, they sat side by side at the great cathedral as the world mourned. Elton was overcome. In his own words, he was barely able to hold himself together. And Diana, sitting next to him, reached over and put her hand on him in what became one of the most circulated photographs of their entire friendship. It looked, to everyone watching, like a princess offering comfort to a grieving man. The truth, which Elton later revealed and which fits perfectly into everything he has ever said about her, was characteristically Diana. He wrote in Me that at the exact moment the cameras captured her leaning toward him, what she was actually doing was leaning past him to reach for a mint that Elton's partner David Furnish was offering. And the warm words she was whispering were, "God, I'd love a polo." Even in grief, even in one of the most photographed moments of the decade, she was herself, irreverent, funny, fundamentally ungovernable. They walked out of the cathedral together with their friendship intact. They made plans for lunch the next time they were both in London. They discussed the idea of Diana becoming a patron of Elton's AIDS Foundation, and him becoming a patron of her landmine charity. There were letters. There was warmth. There was everything ahead of them. 6 weeks later, she was dead. The fax, the funeral, and the song. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Elton was asleep in Nice when his fax machine woke him. The message was from a friend, expressing condolences for awful news. He turned on the television and saw the images from the Pont El Alma tunnel in Paris. At first the reports said she was injured. Then they said she was gone. She was 36 years old. Elton sat in his house, where 6 weeks earlier he had heard her voice on the phone, and tried to comprehend that she was no longer in the world. The grief was complicated by regret. He wrote that he kept thinking about the months they had wasted not speaking. Even though they had made up, he wished he had simply picked up the phone first, that he had chosen the friendship over his pride. He wished he had told her more plainly how much she meant to him while there was still time. Within days, his friend Richard Branson called with a request that had been sparked by something remarkable. People visiting Kensington Palace to lay flowers were writing lines from Elton's 1973 song Candle in the Wind, originally written for Marilyn Monroe. In the condolence books, Branson asked whether Elton would be willing to rewrite the song for Diana and perform it at the funeral. Elton called his longtime lyricist Bernie Taupin immediately. Bernie worked quickly, reworking the words with care and precision. The new opening line became "Goodbye, England's Rose." Elton began to rehearse the new version, terrified of what lay ahead. What was not known at the time was that the royal family was not enthusiastic about Elton performing at all. Documents later released from the National Archives revealed that palace officials had considered the song too sentimental and were resistant enough to the idea that Westminster Abbey had a saxophonist standing by as a replacement, just in case. It took the direct intervention of the Dean of Westminster, the Very Rev. Dr. Wesley Carr, who wrote to the palace arguing that the song was being played constantly across the nation and represented, in his words, popular culture at its best. He prevailed. The saxophonist stood down. On September 6, 1997, Elton John walked into Westminster Abbey and sat at a piano in front of billions of people watching around the world. He later said that in one sense it was the biggest performance of his entire life, for minutes in which the whole world's attention would be fixed on him, and in another sense it was not about him at all. It was the opposite of a concert. He used a teleprompter to make sure he did not accidentally revert to the original Marilyn Monroe lyrics. He kept his eyes down and concentrated entirely on the music, holding himself together by the sheer force of professional discipline. He finished without a mistake. He walked quietly back to his seat. Westminster Abbey was silent for a moment, and then the world exhaled. The song was released as a single shortly after the funeral, produced by the legendary George Martin. It went to #1 in the United Kingdom and across multiple other countries. The Guinness World Records lists it as the highest-selling single since charts began in the 1950s, with over 33 million copies sold, and every penny of those proceeds was directed toward Diana's Memorial Charitable Fund. Despite the scale of that success, Elton has always been clear about what the song represents to him. It is not a hit record. It is a memory of the worst day of his life. He has not performed that version publicly since the funeral, not once. When Prince Harry asked him to perform it again at the concert for Diana in 2007, marking the 10th anniversary of her death, Elton declined, saying it would feel too morbid. He performed your song instead. The 1997 version of Candle in the Wind belongs, in his mind, to one day and one person only, the boy she left behind. After the funeral, with the shock still raw and the grief still enormous, Elton found himself doing something that he has never entirely been able to explain except as an act of love. He looked at William and Harry, 15 and 12 years old, walking behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London in front of a watching world, and he made himself a promise. He wrote in me that he found the way those two boys were treated that day absolutely inhuman. They were told to show no emotion and look straight ahead, to perform dignity while they were still children, while the person they needed most in the world was in the box being carried in front of them. He decided he would not be a distant figure in their lives. He would be a presence, the kind of person their mother had always appreciated, someone real, someone honest, someone who could make them laugh and tell them the truth. Over the years that followed, he hosted them at his homes and gave them space to be ordinary young men away from the machinery of monarchy and press. When Prince Harry later described in his memoir Spare the moments he had shared with Elton, he recalled watching the singer studying the face of Harry's son Archie, and knowing exactly what Elton was thinking. Elton had remarked that Archie looked so much like Diana, especially around the eyes. When Harry and his wife Meghan found themselves under a level of press pressure that Elton recognized with a cold familiarity, the same aggressive pursuit, the same intrusion, the same sense of an institution using the media as a weapon, he did not stay quiet. He stepped forward publicly, offering his home and nice as a private retreat and covering the cost of their private flights so they could travel without the press tracking their movements. He made a public statement in 2019 that he felt a profound sense of obligation to protect Harry and his family from the kind of press intrusion that had contributed to Diana's death. That was not a diplomatic gesture. It was a man keeping a promise he had made to himself 22 years earlier. standing in an abbey with a broken heart. Harry and Elton have also continued Diana's AIDS advocacy together, with Elton supporting the Centerville organization that Harry founded to help children affected by HIV and AIDS in Lesotho. It is, in the clearest possible terms, the continuation of the mission that Diana started in 1987 when she reached out and took a dying man's hand.